This is a picture of a pile of bison skulls taken in the mid-1870s in North America before they were ground into fertilizer. Hey there! Welcome to 1% English Podcast, the daily English show that trains your ears and your brain just 20 minutes a day. Today, together with our two hosts, we'll debate the causes of the 19th century bison slaughter, which nearly drove them to extinction, and the consequences this had for Native American communities.
Today, we're diving into a really significant and frankly tragic moment in North American history. We're talking about the near extinction of the American bison back in the late 19th century. It's hard to even imagine, really, tens of millions of these incredible animals, just central to the whole plains ecosystem, reduced to fewer than 1,000, and all within just a few decades.
It's a shocking statistic, isn't it? And as you say, this wasn't just an ecological disaster, though it certainly was that. It had these deep, lasting consequences, particularly for the indigenous peoples whose entire way of life, their cultures, their economies, their spirituality was so closely tied to the bison.
Exactly. And our discussion today, it draws on, historical accounts, economic studies, reports from the time, all trying to piece together this really complex picture.
Which brings us to our central question for today's debate. What was the primary reason behind this incredibly rapid, massive slaughter of the bison?
Right. And my perspective, what I'll be arguing, is that the fundamental cause here was a conscious, deliberate policy by the U.S. government and its military. It was tied up with westward expansion, and it was strategically aimed at subjugating Native American populations by destroying their main source of sustenance.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. Now, I absolutely acknowledge the military's horrible intent. That's undeniable. But I'm going to argue that the unprecedented scale and the sheer speed of the slaughter, that was primarily kicked off by something else. A powerful economic engine sparked by a foreign technological breakthrough in tanning, creating this huge international demand for bison hides. And this happened in a situation where essentially anyone could hunt them, open access.
Okay, so let me lay out my position more fully then. My core argument is that the most significant driver, the primary force, was this deliberate U.S. military and government policy. The objective seems quite clear from the historical record. Dismantle Native American societies by taking away their food source, their cultural anchor, the bison. And the evidence is, well, it's pretty compelling. You look at statements from major military figures like General William T. Sherman or General Philip Sheridan. Sherman actually suggested inviting sportsmen from England and America for a massive hunt to, and this is his word, pacify Native Americans. The language itself is revealing.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheridan was even more blunt. He stated the destruction of this herd would do more to keep Indians quiet than anything else that could happen except the death of all the Indians. I mean, these aren't just off-the-cuff remarks, right? These statements show a clear strategic goal. They intended to use the bison as a weapon. Turn this animal that gave life into, well, an instrument of war. And this policy, it didn't exist in isolation. It was deeply connected to the idea of manifest destiny. This belief that westward expansion was, inevitable, even divinely ordained, often meant violently removing native peoples. So eliminating the bison, that was seen as a key step to subjugate the people, as they put it, and force them onto reservations. And the impact, the devastating multi-generational impact on indigenous communities, just underlines the severity of this strategy. We know from historical data that within a single generation, the average height of indigenous men dropped over an inch. Child mortality rates shot up by 16 percentage points. Income per capita stayed about 25% lower well into the late 20th century. For these peoples, the bison weren't just, economic assets. They were, as the sources say, key to the economies, but also important cultural and spiritual symbols. Removing them was essentially a weaponization of starvation. It inflicted this deep, lasting spiritual trauma.
Okay, I absolutely hear that. And the human cost and the intent you describe are horrifying and real. But I approach this slightly differently, focusing on the mechanism that allowed this destruction to happen at such an incredible speed and scale. While I don't dispute the military's deplorable aims, I argue that the unprecedented nature of the slaughter itself was fundamentally an economic event. It was driven primarily by what we might call an exogenous factor. Now, exogenous, that's E-X-O-G-E-N-O-U-S, basically means something originating from outside the existing American system. In this case, it was a European tanning innovation combined with a huge international demand for hides, operating in that open access environment you mentioned. So think about the timeline. Before about 1870, bison numbers were declining, various pressures, but nothing like the explosion, the punctuated slaughter that happened right after. There's a key study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, that argues this sudden acceleration was triggered by this foreign innovation specifically. A new way to tan hides developed in England and Germany around 1870, maybe 71. Why was this such a big deal? Well, bison hides were actually really difficult to tan properly before this. This new method suddenly made it possible to turn them into valuable, tough commercial leather. Not for fancy coats, mind you, but for things like shoe soles. And crucially, for industrial belts needed in factories across Europe.
Okay.
And the market reacted almost instantly. The London Times reported in 1872 that English tanners were snapping up these hides and immediately sent orders for, I think it was, 10,000 additional hides to the U.S. This created what they called a flint hide market. That means there was suddenly a year-round, very profitable demand for the raw hides themselves, regardless of whether the meat was good or if it was the right season for robes. And the NBR study points out something really important economically. There were fixed world prices for hides. The global market was so big that it could absorb almost any number of hides the U.S. hunters supplied without the price dropping much. So the incentive to hunt just stayed incredibly high. The U.S. was essentially a price taker, a small player in this global market.
Right.
And you see this reflected directly in the export data. U.S. exports to England just explode. They go from maybe $50,000 a year to over $2 million by 1873. Exports to Germany also shoot up right around the same time. This timeline aligns perfectly with the tanning innovation. This huge economic incentive, that's what fueled the frenzied entry into hunting on such a massive scale. It drove the slaughter much faster and further than I think local demand or even military encouragement alone could have possibly achieved in that time frame. It's also interesting that American tanners initially struggled with these hides too, which sort of reinforces the idea that the primary driver for this massive demand was external or exogenous.
I appreciate you laying out that economic argument. And the tanning innovation is clearly a significant piece of the puzzle, no doubt about it. But I still question whether we can call it the primary driver. Was that economic activity operating independently, or was it, in reality, profoundly shaped, enabled, and even actively encouraged by the military's goals? My perspective is that the profit motive became essentially a tool, a very effective tool, sadly, for carrying out what amounted to a genocidal policy. Yes, hunters wanted profit, but the military wasn't just standing by, were they? Officers were actively encouraging hunters. They saw them as partners in destroying the Native Americans' commissary, their food supply. We can't just ignore the moral dimension here. The deliberate choice to weaponize hunger, reducing it only to market forces, feels incomplete. The scale of the human tragedy, the multi-generational impact we talked about, that points to something deeper, something more intentional than just, supply and demand.
I see why you emphasize the intent, and it's a crucial part of the story. But for me, the sheer scale, millions upon millions killed in just over 10 years, that points overwhelmingly to economics as the engine of destruction. Hunters were driven by the potential for huge profits, much more directly than by military orders, even if the military was, shall we say, pleased with the result. That NBER paper puts it very clearly. The slaughter on the plains was initiated by a foreign-made innovation and fueled by a foreign demand for industrial leather. The military's desire to control Native Americans was the backdrop, absolutely, But the mechanism, the way the bison were actually wiped out so fast, that was economic. Think about it. Without that powerful international market paying top dollar for every single hide, could the military's policy alone have achieved such complete devastation so quickly? I doubt it. It would likely have been much slower, maybe less total. You know, those horrifying pictures of mountains of bison skulls, like at the Michigan Carbon Works waiting to be ground into fertilizer. That speaks to an industrial scale, profit-driven machine, something far beyond just military strategy. It's about the means as much as the motive.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? When we look back at history and there are multiple things happening at once, how do we separate an underlying cause from something that just made it happen faster, an accelerating factor? That idea, the exogenous factor you brought up, the foreign tanning innovation, it certainly seems to have shifted the whole dynamic of bison hunting, didn't it?
Exactly. And that leads to the next point, about things like railroads and better rifles, like the Sharp's Big 50. You might argue they were the cause, but were they?
Well, I would argue that those technologies, the railroads especially, and the whole infrastructure of westward expansion, they weren't just incidental. They were absolutely integral to making the military's objectives feasible and happen at that incredible speed. Railroads didn't just make transport easier. They literally brought, as historical accounts say, swarms of hide hunters right into the heart of the bison ranges. They enabled things like shooting from rail cars, turning hunting into an almost industrial process. And remember, this expansion wasn't just about economics in some neutral sense. It was fundamentally about asserting control over land and resources, displacing indigenous people. The bison were undeniably in the way of that project. There's that phrase, right? Colonialism and capitalism travel together. These forces weren't separate, they were deeply intertwined, feeding each other in the broader goal of conquest.
I understand that perspective, linking technology to the expansionist policy, but I push back slightly. While railroads and better guns certainly made hunting more efficient, I don't think they were the necessary conditions for the mass slaughter itself. My point is, they amplified an existing, incredibly powerful economic incentive, but they didn't create it. We know bison populations were already being divided by trails before the railways fully penetrated. And significantly, there was large-scale killing happening in parts of Canada before the railways arrived there, suggesting the railway wasn't the absolute prerequisite. The critical element, according to the economic analysis, was the high fixed value placed on the hides due to that international demand. Technology just optimized the harvesting of that value. The model emphasizes the fixed price and the open access. Those were the paramount economic conditions. Without the intense demand making each hide so valuable, the efficiency gains from tech would have had a much smaller overall impact.
Looking at the consequences, though, the really long-term reverberating effects of this slaughter on indigenous peoples, effects still felt today in socioeconomic disparities. It just underscores for me that we can't talk about conservation, even historically, without addressing the deep historical injustices involved. When we see modern restoration efforts, like the Fort Belknap Reservation managing its own bison herd, that's not just about ecology, is it? It's profoundly about cultural healing, reconnection, restoring something sacred that was violently taken away. This history forces us to recognize the value of a species far beyond its potential for economic commodification, and commodification, commodification, that's the process of turning something, in this case, a sacred animal, into just another product to be bought and sold for profit. The loss of the bison was more than economic. The trauma is still, as you say, reverberating, meaning it continues to echo and have effects long after the event.
That's a very powerful point, and I completely agree that the human cost and the ongoing legacy for indigenous communities have to be central to how we understand this. It's not just history, it's present reality. But the bison story also offers, I think, a really stark, universal lesson about the dangers of open access resources meeting global markets. That NBR paper makes a connection that's frankly quite chilling for today. It says many developing countries today are heavily reliant on resource exports, and few, if any, have stringent regulations. The bison history is a cautionary tale showing how fast international demand from wealthy countries can absolutely decimate a resource that might otherwise have lasted centuries. It's a case study in unsustainable exploitation driven by global economics.
A sobering thought.
It is. But maybe there is a slightly more hopeful angle, too, in terms of lessons learned. We see some modern conservation initiatives trying to learn from this past. Things like the American Prairie's Wild Sky program, which actually pays ranchers financial incentives to make their land more wildlife-friendly, including for bison. It's an attempt to integrate economic realities with conservation goals, maybe trying to avoid repeating the mistakes where economic drivers led purely to destruction. It shows an evolution in thinking, perhaps.
Okay, so to summarize my position then, for me, the near extinction of the bison is above all a testament to the devastating power of deliberate human policy, specifically the U.S. military strategy to undermine Native American societies. While those economic forces you detailed, the tanning innovation, the global market, certainly poured fuel on the fire, accelerating the disaster, the fundamental motivation stemmed from an act of colonial violence, and the consequences, the socio-cultural trauma, continue to reverberate today.
And to summarize my view, the sheer speed and the almost unbelievable scale of the bison slaughter, which really stands out in the history of wildlife destruction, that is best explained by the immense global economic forces set in motion by that specific exogenous tanning technology. It's a stark example of how open access resources can vanish almost overnight when faced with powerful international demand and the commodification of that resource, turning a living being into essentially an industrial input.
It's certainly clear, listening to both perspectives, that this wasn't a simple event with a single cause. You had military strategy, westward expansion, new technologies, and these incredibly powerful economic incentives all tangled together, leading to this catastrophic outcome.
Absolutely. And exploring these different angles, I think it gives us a much richer understanding of history's complexities and maybe helps us think more clearly about the challenges of conservation and resource management even today. The ongoing work by groups like American Prairie and especially the vital efforts led by Native American tribes to bring bison back, that whole story reflects this continuing dialogue about ecology, economics, and historical justice. There's definitely more to explore here.
Indeed. Now, for everyone listening, here's a little something to think about, part of our goal of getting just 1% better in how we analyze things. Consider a major historical event or maybe a significant change that happened in your own country or region. Can you identify maybe 2 or 3 distinct reasons or forces that contributed to it? And importantly, how might those different factors have influenced each other? Maybe chat about it with a friend or just jot down a few thoughts. It's a great exercise in looking beyond single causes and seeing those complex connections.
Congrats! You just crushed your 1% for today. If you're loving this podcast, show that subscribe button some love. And don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss your daily dose of 1%. That's it for today. Take care, keep growing, and we'll see you tomorrow.